Okay, it's a couple minutes past 1 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to this webinar on Learn to Speak STEMish, finishing the reframed story of after-school STEM. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box, and we will be closing the poll in just a second here. So if you'd like to take this opportunity to let us know whether you attended the first webinar or watched a recording of the first webinar, please go ahead and fill out that poll, and we'll close it out in just a second here. So while we're doing that, just a couple of housekeeping notes. If the webinar is running slow for you for any reason, please try closing out other programs that might be bandwidth intensive, like streaming music or video on your computer so that the webinar goes a bit more smoothly for you. If you're having audio difficulties, keep that number in handy. This number will also pop up repeatedly in the chat box every so often. That's the phone line that you can dial into. And if you have a question or a comment, do use the group chat to write down your questions or comments, and we will be monitoring it to make sure that we have a chance to answer your questions and discuss towards the end of the webinar. So our presenters today, I'm Anita Krishnamurthy. I'm the Vice President for STEM Policy here at the Afterschool Alliance. And joining me is Jen Nichols, who's a Senior Associate with the Learning Team at the Frameworks Institute, which has been doing some amazing work around messaging in a lot of different areas. But for our interest today, it's around STEM education, and specifically STEM education and out-of-school time programs. So I'm going to turn it over to Jen, and she will do a quick recap of what we did last time, and then dive into the rest of the conversation here today. Great, thanks. Jen, take it away. All right, Jen.
Sorry, I had my mute on. Hi, everyone. Let's try that again. I was just saying thank you for joining us today. It looks like a lot of you attended the first webinar in this series in April. So for those of you who did, we're going to offer a brief recap before we move on to the new materials. For those of you who missed the first one, as I said, I'll run through very briefly what we covered the last time, but you can also access that pre-recorded webinar after this webinar is over to catch up on what those things were that we talked about the first time. So I'm Jen. I'm from the Frameworks Institute, and in a nutshell, Frameworks is a nonprofit communications think tank. So what we do is try to advance the communications effectiveness of advocates and researchers working in all kinds of social issue areas. And we do that by mapping the gaps between how experts think and talk about a social issue and how the public thinks and understands that same social issue. And then we fill in those gaps by designing and testing communications tools that can help the public to think more like experts, to think more like all of you do, in this case, about STEM learning. So we test them, and once we've tested them and are assured that they'll work to improve your communications, then we make those recommendations. So we're walking through our recommendations today on how to talk about STEM learning. Now the research that we're talking about today comes from a bigger body of research we've done on how to talk about education and education reform in general. That was a long-term study that we've done for a total of it's about $2 million worth of research that you have access to. It's all available online on our website. But in particular, this subset of research that we did on STEM and informal STEM learning was a 3-year multi-funder project. So we've spent a lot of time with the public, thinking with them about how they think and talk about STEM, how they understand it, and have come up with some recommendations that we've tested for you that you can apply to your communications. Now, I mentioned we'll recap very quickly what we talked about last time. And before we get to some of our recommendations, it's important to understand that when we talk about how the public thinks and talks about social issues, what we're really talking about are what anthropologists call cultural models. And a good way to think about cultural models is that they're the cognitive shortcuts that we use to make sense of information very quickly. So, you know, we're all inundated with information all the time. We're constantly getting new information and new stimuli, and frankly, our brains have to process it rapidly. And the way that our brains have developed to process that information as quickly as possible is through cultural models. So these are ways of organizing information. And what that means is that when you get information in a communication, say the kinds of messages that you share with people whose support you want for after-school STEM programs, that information comes in and it attaches to whatever information people already have in their brains. So it's all of our experiences, the assumptions that we make about the world as a result of our lived experiences. And we all have these cultural models, and here are a few key things to keep in mind. Okay, they're widely shared. So those cultural models, they are part of the way we think and the way we view the world. They're the default assumptions that we make about issues, and they're fed by culture, by the books we read, the news we watch, the stories we hear, the films we see. All of those things help feed those cultural models. So they're widely shared. There are multiple cultural models on any topic, and sometimes they contradict each other, but our brains are capable of having multiple cultural models in play at the same time to help us make sense very quickly of new information that may be completely unfamiliar to us. So cultural models structure our thinking. How we interpret new information is dependent on what information is already in our minds on any given topic. And those models are activated by associated information. So when something comes in, if it's information that's unfamiliar to us, our brains use those shortcuts to quickly find something similar and associated with that. This thing must be like that other thing that I already know. Okay, so that's how cultural models work. And what that means is that sometimes it's not like we drop our messages into people's brains where they swim around like little fish in a fishbowl and live there happy and whole. Instead, our brains are really more like these rich cognitive ecosystems. And so at Frameworks, we've developed the metaphor of the swamp to talk about what those cultural models are and all the kinds of things that are in our brains. So just like a real swamp, our communications encounter that cognitive ecosystem that we all carry around inside our heads. And there are alligators in there and nice things too, like orchids. But the alligators are unproductive default models that can actually eat your message and keep it from getting through in the way that you intended. But there are some positive things in every swamp too, and those are cultural models or default ways of thinking that are sometimes less readily available to us, but they're still there. We just have to call them forth. And the way we call forth good, positive cultural models that help our message get interpreted correctly and push back or navigate around the alligators or the models that are unhelpful to our message is through language cues. And that's what framing is. It's choosing the right cues to help your message be as effective as possible. So last time I gave you a full detailed tour of this swamp of cultural models, the models people have readily available to think and reason about informal STEM learning and how it works, why it matters, and what causes disparities, what causes problems within the realm of STEM learning. I'm just going to focus in on a few today that I want to call your attention to so we can talk about how you address those particular models or communications challenges. So it's important to remember that for the majority of the public, when you say STEM, what they automatically default to is science. So technology, engineering, and math get left out, and it's important to boost their understanding, the public's understanding that STEM is more than science. Yes, it's science, but it's these other disciplines as well. And to move their understanding away from math is something that's very dry and rote, or technology is something that's only about computers, or engineering is something that's only for advanced students, older students who are now in college. We need people to understand that STEM disciplines are much richer than their sort of narrow, limited definitions of them are. We need them to understand that STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and math, and that even the youngest children can be exposed to those subjects, and that it's good for STEM to be introduced to kids when they're young rather than waiting for them to get to high school. So those are all things we need to communicate through the messages that we send out about informal STEM learning to help boost people's understanding. If you look to the right side of the swamp, you see a category called learning. People really have difficulty understand how learning happens. They think it's just sort of natural, that they do understand that it should be hands-on, but they make a distinction between what kinds of learning should be hands-on and what shouldn't. So, for example, they don't understand the relationship between doing hands-on learning in an after-school program and how that can actually boost children's learning in a formal setting, or that formal settings can actually also have hands-on learning opportunities. People default when you ask them what do kids need today to succeed, to do well in school and be prepared for career and college in the future. They always kind of default to, we need to get back to the basics, right? The 3 R's. They don't understand that what children need to learn today is different than what they needed to learn a few decades ago, because our world is rapidly growing more and more technological, and the challenges that we face are different than the challenges that we faced a few decades ago. So children need to learn different kinds of skills to be able to make their way in the world successfully, and to be able to lead our country, to be engaged citizens, to be engaged members of their community, and to have the skills they need for college and career. And then if you look at the lower right-hand corner, learning locations, there's a real blind spot or black box way of understanding learning and where children learn, what they need to learn well, so that informal programs, out of school, after school, summer programs, all of those kinds of learning opportunities are seen as they're nice to have, but they're not necessary to children's learning. So that's a challenge that all of you who are communicating about after-school programs have to overcome in your messages to help build people's understanding that it's not just a nice to have or a nice supplement. It's actually really critical that children have access to these programs in order to learn well. And to take that back to the classroom and be able to perform well too, so that so the public can understand that educational disparities in part can be addressed by improving children's access to after-school, informal, summer, out-of-school, weekend learning opportunities. They also have a default understanding that learning is, children's brains are like batteries that get drained and then they need to be charged up through relaxation and time off, and they can't have structured learning all the time because it's not good for them. So the public doesn't understand that kids are learning all the time, and giving them more opportunities to learn in a constructive way really boosts their learning overall. So we need to change that in our communications to help them understand that. And then finally, the public gets stuck on the idea that informal learning is really, low stakes, that kids need free time. They don't need to be in program after program, that it's just too much and kids' lives are too complicated today. So that's another challenge that you face, or another alligator in your swamp of STEM and informal STEM learning. And then finally, on the lower left-hand side, we're going to spend some time talking about this today. People have a lot of strong defaults that they use to reason about why there are disparities in STEM learning outcomes among groups. The first is the default to individualism or personal drive, the idea that when some children do well in STEM disciplines academically and others don't, it's because some kids are just naturally more motivated than others to do well. That's a big challenge you face in talking with people about the need for more STEM programs. There's a lot of zero-sum thinking, which is people's default rationalization that if you give more to some other group, it necessarily means taking more away from some other group that already has it. So that's a challenge in building support among the public for more STEM programs across the board so all kids have access to it. So we'll talk about how to deal with that problem, that challenge. And then cultural differences. There's a lot of default thinking swirling around out there about how some groups are just naturally more inclined than others to do certain kinds of things. So that's a big challenge you face. And then finally, that there are types of kids. There are some kids who are just good at science and some kids who just aren't. All of those default models of thinking really are challenges that you face in talking with the public about the programs that you run, why they need to be supported, and why you need more of them. more and better. So we're going to focus on those today. Very briefly, what we talked about last time were a couple of recommendations. First, it's important to understand that the public needs to have certain cognitive holes filled in for them. So if your communications don't answer some of the public's primary questions about a particular social issue, about STEM learning, when you are communicating with them, then they're going to fill in their own answers to those questions with all those default models that you just saw in the swamp. So the chief questions we're looking at here are, why does this matter? They need to know what's at stake, why this is important. They need to understand what's this about or how does it work. So you need to explain how it works and not assume that they know how STEM learning works, because most people don't. And if it's not working, why not? So you need to talk about what the problems are and how we can fix them. And then finally, who's going to fix it? So we need messages that attribute responsibility to collective action, to public policy, to more programming that moves people away from blaming individuals for problems and rather thinks about collective solutions. So far we've talked about, last time we talked about one value for answering that question, why does this matter, which is the future preparation value. This is about preparing our society for the challenges of the future. And we looked at a metaphor, the STEM fluency, which explains how children learn STEM and how informal STEM enhances their STEM learning skills. So learning STEM subjects is like learning a new language. To become fluent, children need immersive hands-on opportunities to practice what they learn. So we're going to continue filling in this story with some more values, metaphors, and solutions. Today we're going to look at fairness across places as a value, explanatory examples we tested to see how you could boost the public's understanding, and a couple other metaphors that we've developed as well, and we'll go through those now one at a time. So first up, there's a real tendency in the public to think about the individual benefits of STEM learning, which actually defeats people's support or depresses people's support for STEM learning because you're focused on the individual. People don't see what's at stake in it for them if they don't have a child in school, if they themselves aren't concerned about their own individual child's welfare. It's harder for them to see what's so important that they should care, in particular about boosting support for STEM programs, informal and after-school STEM programs. So instead, what we're recommending is that you advance a more collective prosperity frame. So instead of messages that talk about how it's important for children to study STEM because it can lead to more financially lucrative careers later on, let's instead reframe that to talk about how we all benefit if we are able to produce a generation of students who are prepared to handle all of the STEM jobs that are showing up in the marketplace, which will help, as a result, our economy to thrive, and that benefits everybody. So this is what that prosperity message looks like. The story you're telling is that, for our future leaders to have the skills needed for a prosperous information age economy, we need to commit our resources to help all children develop STEM knowledge and skills. So that's the message, that's the concept that you're trying to communicate as an answer to that question of why this matters or what's at stake. Okay, so it helps move people away from that idea that learning STEM is really just about people's individual gain. It helps them think about STEM more productively, and then helps people understand that there's a real social impact to improving children's access to STEM. So this is just a graph to show you how, when we tested the value of collective prosperity, which is it's the purple bar graphs that you see that are on the farther left, the far left side of each one of these stacks of results. We tested that against other values. So we gave people a message. Several thousand folks were online. Each one of them got a message framed with a particular value. And then we asked them a series of policy questions to measure their knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs about STEM and informal STEM learning after they'd been exposed to one of these candidate values. And we measured the boost across against a baseline of a control group that had received no exposure to any of the candidate values. Okay, so you can see that collective prosperity, more than any of these other values, really boosted people's support for the idea that all children can learn STEM, that there are real civic benefits to boosting their access to STEM learning, and that we all have a responsibility to support programs that improve STEM learning. Okay, so collective prosperity is a very robust frame. Quickly, just an example of what it might look like to take an existing communication and reframe it with a prosperity frame. On the left-hand side of your screen, you see a passage from a real communication that's framed with individual benefits. So this talks about, from a purely economic standpoint, students are better off getting an education in STEM because they'll earn more money over time. Well, here's that same piece, but it's been reframed not to focus on students' individual gain, but rather our collective social gain. So more and better STEM education for our students today can help us build a prosperous future we can all enjoy. When students are able to be part of the future workforce because they're equipped for it, that helps them to get jobs, which we depend on them doing in order for our workforce to thrive, which keeps our economy going. So, giving students access now to quality STEM learning is a smart investment for our nature's future well-being. Okay, so let's move on to talking about some of those other challenges we looked at in the swamp, and in particular, talking about the defaults that people go to in rationalizing disparities in STEM. So the idea that it's about personal drive or willpower, the idea that some groups are just more equipped to do STEM, to work and succeed in STEM disciplines than others. We want to move people away from defaulting to those ways of thinking. So we need to change language cues that are unintentionally driving people to those conclusions, and instead focus on this question of resource distribution. So it's not about groups, but rather about systems that distribute STEM learning resources unevenly across our nation. Let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean. Okay, first, to answer the question of why does this matter, you can turn to fairness across places value, which is different than fairness between groups, because whereas fairness between groups still reminds people that they have these default assumptions about different groups or different kinds of people, talking about fairness across places is really talking about a system that isn't working right. So the story here is that no matter where children live, they should have opportunities to access quality STEM learning environments. And our research shows that if you talk about fairness as a matter of geographic resource distribution, people are able to move their thinking away from people and their assumptions about people to a bigger systems level way of thinking about structures and structural inequities that can help them support the kinds of programs that you support as experts and advocates. So it really helps structure a system's perspective, moves them away from thinking about people, and then increases, by doing that, actually increases their support for policies that benefit disadvantaged groups. For example, kids in rural locations, children in African or Hispanic communities who don't have access to the same kinds of quality STEM learning opportunities that other children do. Okay, and alongside of that is a metaphor of charging stations, which is a way of explaining what it is that some communities lack that could actually boost their children's STEM outcomes. And the story you're telling with the metaphor of charging stations is that learning opportunities are like charging stations, but the problem is that access to these stations varies from community to community or from place to place. So we need to make powerful charging stations available to all children everywhere so they can charge up and take an active role in their learning. Okay, so charging stations allows you to explain how beyond just classroom STEM disciplines, children need access to programs at museums, to community programs that unite universities with local schools and help children boost their STEM skills in that way, to library programs, all the kinds of things that all of you are supporting already through your daily work. Right? So it helps illuminate the relationship, again, just like Fairness Across Places does, between inequitable outcomes and structural resource deficits that can be repaired, and helps people expand their thinking about all the different places in which children learn, that it's not just classroom education that children need to do well, but if we can give them these other programs, they're likely to benefit from that. And it makes it a collective problem. Our communities lack something, and we can fix it by giving our communities those things, those charging stations that they're lacking. So I'm about to play a little clip for you. One of the ways that we have of testing metaphors is to take them on the street and ask people, we give them a little paragraph explaining the concepts, and then we ask them some open-ended questions about what they now understand about STEM and informal STEM learning, having listened to this metaphor, but having been exposed to it. So this is just a little clip of some of the people we talked on the street. We have many more hours of these clips. It's part of our research process, but I have this clip to show you just so you can see how people are able to think differently about STEM once they have been exposed to this metaphor.
What do you think of that metaphor? Learning opportunities are like charging stations.
I do.
Being here in Annapolis, you have an incredible wealth of charging stations.
Some communities that have like community gardens,
The Smithsonian,
big art programs.
the Symphony.
You have some areas that have the capability to provide the technology to the kids.
There are spotty places where it isn't.
Areas that don't.
Some of the areas of West Virginia where you have to drive 50 miles.
You feel bad for those particular areas.
That makes sense as an idea, as a way to think about the country as a whole.
Each student having a charge, having energy to devote toward the subject.
Every child has that right, that they would get the best education you can give them.
Okay, so you can see in there how people are able to grasp ideas that the swamp shows that they couldn't grasp before. And if you looked at if you listened or participated in the last webinar, you would have seen a series of interviews with people on the street without having been exposed to a metaphor that shows them struggling to understand the kinds of things that people are now able to understand easily in this video clip because they've been exposed to the charging stations metaphor. So here you hear people talking about, yes, children do need access to this. We need to do that. All children should have access. So these are tools you can use to really boost people's understanding of the need to improve the number and quality of after-school, out-of-school, summertime, weekend learning, STEM learning opportunities so that we can close those disparities, fix those disparities among different groups' outcomes in STEM learning objectives. Here's another before and after. Now this is, again, another real communication about STEM learning, and if you take just a moment to read what you see on the left side of the screen, there's a lot of focus here on, there's some real fatalism, that this is a crisis, which is not the best way to frame communication. If you want people to engage, you're actually likely to turn them off if you make your problem sound too urgent, because they'll feel they just don't have any options, that they'll be overwhelmed, and that kind of crisis tone can actually hurt your message. So our state is among the lowest 5 performing states in math and science proficiency. There are dramatic achievement gaps, and now here the paragraph goes on to focus on all these different groups. Now remember, in the swamp, there are all these default models that people have of explaining away disparities in academic performance as something that somehow the fault of individual people or different groups. And we need to move people away from that way of thinking, because when people blame the problems on individuals, then they don't support solutions that are collective, that are policy-minded, because they see the solutions as within those individuals, and none of us can fix somebody else. That's sort of the rationale that people are using to explain disparities. So this is unintentionally queuing up all of those default ways of thinking. So it's not intended, but that's the unintended consequence. The alligator they're running into is that people will read this and think, oh, right, that's because some groups are just better than others at STEM. Some kids just don't have the drive to succeed at STEM. So we've taken this passage and reframed it using fairness across places and charging stations instead. So all the yellow underlines on the right-hand side of the screen just calls attention to some of the ways that we built in the use of that value in the metaphor to help make the case for needing to address disparities at a structural or collective level. So informal learning opportunities act like charging stations, so we're really explaining. We're talking about museums and science centers and summer camps and after-school programs, all the things that kids need when the school day ends to boost their STEM skills development outside of school. Not all kids have access to that, so we need to make sure they have better access to charging stations regardless of where they live so that they can charge up their learning and power up their learning. Okay, so it's a really different way of getting the same point across. And once you've explained this, then you can go back to talking about the specific, you know, who are the groups that you're trying to address, but you really need to talk about it first. Is this about fairness across places? This is about building more charging stations, and then you can, you know, draw people's attention to what is the program that you're talking about advocating for. How do you help people? How are you contributing to the number of charging stations in your community? How are you contributing to fairness across places? And you can then take the time to really explain your program and how it works. So let's just do a quick check-in. This is a little quiz. Take the time to read these 3 responses and then indicate A, B, or C. Which of these statements best models charging stations? So you can just click A, B, or C in the poll. Give you just a few more seconds to weigh in. Okay, wow. So overwhelmingly, you've all chosen C. So A+. I think we can conclude this webinar right now. You guys clearly know what's going on here, which is great. So yeah, access to STEM charging stations, the chance to plug into after-school programs, museums, libraries is missing from some of our communities. Let's change that so all kids can have powerful STEM learning opportunities. That's a really good, that's a good use or model of the, of the STEM charging stations metaphor. I apologize for the type at the top of the screen. So the first one doesn't work as well because it's really still, it doesn't explain what we mean by charging stations, and then it focuses on having them motivated enough to plug into them. So again, that comes back to personal blame. It's children's fault if they don't have the drive to be invested in STEM learning. And then B, in order to give the kids the chance to live better lives than their parents, we need to step up our STEM game, and this is about their financial future. So that just really calls up, even though it kind of explains charging stations a little bit, though not as much as C, it still falls back on individual gain, which is likely to shut people down. It doesn't help those who don't have a very specific direct link to children and STEM learning to understand what's at stake for our society largely. So good job, everyone. Now, one last thing I want to bring to your attention, which is that, as I mentioned at the start of this, the public just doesn't really understand what STEM is, how STEM programs work, what children get out of them, how they boost learning, and what kinds of skills children gain from STEM programs. So if you don't understand the value of a STEM program, then you're less likely to support it because you don't know what kinds of valuable skills children learn by going through those programs, right? So we need to move our messaging away from cues that let people default to that, to filling in whatever they want to fill in or whatever they think they know. So that means that our messages need to be really concrete and explanatory. We can't be vague. We can't just use abstract concepts. We can't let the public default to kind of filling in their own cognitive holes. We have to answer those questions for them. And that's where explanatory examples can really help us here too. Now, we wanted to know, since the public doesn't really understand these issues, whether using an explanatory example to really offer people a concrete, clear vision of how a STEM program works, the soup to nuts version of a program, what kids are learning, how it works, if that would help boost their understanding. And what you're looking at here is evidence that, in fact, using those explanatory examples really does. So we tested a series of examples. I'll show you one in just a second what they look like, to explain specific after-school programs. So an after-school program about music production, one about robotics, one about computer programming, and one about a community garden. And we used those examples on people. We gave them an example and then asked them a series of questions to measure their knowledge about after-school STEM programs and what they do, and also their attitudes towards the kinds of goals that after-school STEM programs are intended to achieve. So things like fixing disparities, moving kids beyond basic understandings, the idea that STEM is for all children, STEM disciplines are for all children, that there are civic benefits to STEM, but then also just their basic understanding of how things work, that STEM programs are about exploration, hands-on, that they boost outcomes for children's academic performance, and that they're an important part of children's overall education. You can see here that across the board, these, and I should insert here, our researchers were jumping up and down for joy when they saw these results, because these are fantastic, very robust results compared to the kinds of significant results we get in other issue areas for other kinds of tests we do. These are some of the best results we've received ever in 16 years of doing this research. So using an explanatory example really shows big gains in the public's understanding and support for informal STEM learning. Where you see a couple of the music production and robotics are a little lower than some of the other results, and we attribute that to the fact that those particular kinds of examples do tend to have even more deeply embedded defaults for the public around who engages in those kinds of activities. So that just means that if you're using a music production or robotics example to explain after-school programs, just really wrap them well in the values of fairness across places, the metaphors like charging stations, and it'll still help to boost people's understanding of what they are, how they work, how they help children. So here's an example. I'll give you just a moment to read that. Now this is a community garden example that really, if you look at it, takes people through a clear example. So it explains that a community garden after-school program helps children from all backgrounds, so from all places, grow their own fruits and vegetables, and through that they learn environmental science, plant biology, they develop critical thinking skills. Here's how it works. They work in teams, so they're learning teamwork. They're supervised by STEM experts from local universities and botanic gardens, and then they get to create growing strategies. They learn to adjust their approach when problems crop up. So you can see it goes on and on. It takes the time to explain all the nuts and bolts of how this program works and what skills children achieve from it. So that's an explanatory example. Those are the kinds of things you need to build into your communications to boost people's understanding. And the most effective examples to use in your communications are explanatory. So again, really spell out how the program works and link it to the activities they're link the activities they're doing to what outcomes are achieved as a result of those activities. They're unexpectedly inclusive, so they help move the public away from thinking that only nerdy kids participate in after-school STEM programs or only certain kinds of kids. So that helps the public understand, yes, all children can participate and will participate well in these programs if they have the opportunity to do so. And then it's really helpful to link these kinds of after-school programs to STEM careers so that you can show the real-world relevance of these kinds of programs for children's future learning and career. So your examples should really highlight non-economic benefits, move people away. It's good to talk about shared prosperity, but move people away from focusing on how STEM careers pay more than other kinds of careers, because that's that individualism you want to avoid. Help people see that younger children can have access to STEM and do well, and it's important for them to have access to STEM. And then finally, when you can, build in examples of how math is incorporated into informal STEM learning opportunities to push people away from thinking that math is just something that's really dry and rote and it's memorization of tables, that sort of thing. Okay, so we're at the end here. We've finished our reframe story. We looked at this arc a little bit earlier, and we filled it in some more with some more values and metaphors. So why does this matter? It's about preparing for the future. It's about making sure that all children, no matter where they live, have access to quality, informal STEM learning opportunities, and it's about building a prosperous economy for all of us. What's it about, or how does it work? Well, in addition to this being about building children's STEM fluency, we have explanatory examples now that will show people how it works. And one thing we haven't had a chance to cover in this webinar, but it's available in the toolkit and resources that Anita will talk with you about in just a moment. Out-of-school learning opportunities function as an important part of the STEM learning ecosystem. So we have another metaphor, STEM ecosystem, that focuses on the relationship of out-of-school learning to in-school learning and how those two bolster each other to really improve children's outcomes overall. If it's not working, why not? Well, now charging stations, you have that as a metaphor that you can explain. There are disparities among groups because not all groups have access to the things they need to have better academic outcomes, to gain the skills that STEM lets them gain when they have sufficient and high quality exposure to working and playing and practicing STEM subjects. And who's going to fix it? Well, you are through your out-of-school program. So you can insert your program here. So you are the solution, and you need to make that clear. And you can talk about how your programs spark learning or ignite interest by letting children and youth experiment with STEM ideas in real-world situations or hands-on ways. So that's one last metaphor that we have. It's what we call metaphor kernel. It's a concept, which is that idea of you activating children's learning. And that also is in the resources that Anita will talk with you about in just a second. One last thing I'd like to do, which is to play a STEM animation for you that we created in conjunction with the Afterschool Alliance that puts all of these metaphors and values together into one animation. It's a good resource for you. It's available on the afterschoolstemhub.org website. That you can use it in presentations about after-school STEM programs. You can put it on your websites and use it however you like. It's a resource that models for you all of the frame elements that we've talked about in this webinar and the past one. So I'll step aside so you can watch that video, and then after that I'll come back and I'll ask you to fill out a feedback form, and then we'll take some questions.
We don't know what the future will bring, but we do know how to prepare to face the challenges ahead. Today's economy and tomorrow's innovations are powered by STEM: science, technology, engineering, and math. For a bright, prosperous future, we need all children to have great STEM learning opportunities. Why? Because in a fast-paced, information-driven world, it's more important than ever that our future leaders, neighbors, and workers are prepared to solve problems and know how to gather and evaluate evidence to make decisions. These are the thinking habits that STEM learning cultivates. After-school programs that engage kids in the afternoons, on the weekends, or in the summer are perfect for activating STEM learning. After-school STEM is creative and varied and offers children the freedom to explore, experiment, and gain hands-on experience. Some programs give kids an opportunity to work alongside tech professionals to design new mobile apps their friends can use, create an animation, or program a robot. In others, children might learn about bay ecology, or diseases, or dinosaurs. After-school programs let kids learn many different intertwined STEM skills together. For example, a program in a setting like a community garden, students can conduct scientific observations on how the environment affects certain plants. They can learn how to leverage technology such as selecting new tools for tasks or using sensors to monitor key indicators. They can also exercise their math skills by calculating rainfall, nutrients, or crop yields. And they can think like engineers while building structures and systems for their plots. Because these learning environments are flexible and allow kids to explore their interests, after-school STEM programs are especially effective at reaching a wide range of young people, not just those who already think of themselves as math and science kids. School-age children spend just 20% of their waking hours in school. Studies show that the more time they spend in hands-on after-school STEM learning environments, the more likely they are to keep charging their interest in these critical topics. We can spark the next generation's STEM knowledge and skills by making sure that all communities offer opportunities that invite and incite young people's interest. Community resources like after-school programs, libraries, zoos, and aquariums all working together. These are the kinds of charging stations we need to support, expand, and value in our communities to power up STEM learning. Let's light up our future. Let's spark the kind of know-how that powers industry and ignites innovation. Let's create spaces and places for kids to discover and explore the world they live in, and equip them to shape the world they'll inherit. STEM after school. It's time to activate.
Okay, so in that you could see all of the metaphors, charging station, STEM fluency, ecosystem, all of those things coming to life, along with values like fairness across places and future prosperity. So with that, I'm concluded. I'm going to turn this over to Anita, but let me ask you just one last thing, which is for you to click on the link that Dan is about to post in the chat box for you, or you may be able to click it in the box link too. To our feedback form. I really value your honest feedback on the webinar. I use it to improve my teaching for all of my future engagements. So please do let us know how you feel about the webinar, if it's useful to you. Your comments are very valuable, and I'm going to turn this over to Anita now. Thanks everyone for your time, and I look forward to chatting with you in the Q&A in just a few minutes.
Great. Thanks so much, Jen. I hope everyone on the webinar has found this information really useful. We'd really love to hear from you about whether you think you can go out now and use these messages or need additional supports in order to be able to do that. Please do type your thoughts and questions into the chat box. We'd love to engage in a conversation and discussion with you about this. And if it doesn't happen today, of course, you're always welcome to reach out to me separately. In the meantime, as Jen said, let me tell you about this resource we have for you to get access to all this material. The slide that is up on your screen shows you a website, afterschoolstemhub.org, and this is actually the website for a project that we're leading here at the After School Alliance with a bunch of stakeholders, and I'll mention those in a moment. That's really aimed at helping us think much more carefully about how we communicate about after-school STEM. And our goal really is to come up with very coherent and compelling messages that we can all start to use across the field, recognizing that all of us have our own needs and agendas, but if there are some common ways that we can frame the issue and talk about it, that we'll be able to move the needle that much faster. So as part of this hub project, which was funded by the Noyce Foundation, we worked with Frameworks last year on this research and generating the tools for the field to use. So what I'm going to do is actually do a quick walkthrough of this website, a live walkthrough, so that I can show you what all the various resources are that you can access, download, share, and use. So this is what the website looks like when you go to it. And where my cursor is right now is where the video, you can play the video here, but I'll show you in a moment where you can actually download the video and use it in your own presentations or meetings or wherever else you might like. We have a talking points section that sort of goes through, again, the kind of logical flow that Jen was presenting about why does this matter, how does it work, what is the problem, what can we do about it. And there are sort of short versions of talking points, and then this thing called Talking Points Plus, which gives you explanatory examples that you can also use. The Quick Start Campaign Guide, again, sort of just walks you through how we might be used to talking about it right now and what new frames might work better to do that. Here are some resources that you might find really useful. We have some infographics that we've created that, again, you can download. You can download pieces of it. It's a one-page full-color infographic, but there's individual pieces that you can download and share in various formats. We have PowerPoint slides that we've created with a lot of these messages that you can download and, again, put into your, they're available in a very plain format, so you can just cut and paste it into whatever template you use for your own presentations. Really pilfer at will. We have some fact sheets that you can download about after-school STEM, and then this video that that Jen just showed in both sort of high resolution and a standard high definition and standard definition formats. We have a frequently asked questions section, which might be very useful and interesting for you to look through. So, for example, I know that global competition is something that we're all very, very used to using as the reason when we go out to get funding or making the case to our state and local policymakers. And as you might have heard Jen say, that is one of the things that they actually recommend we steer away from. And so there are some good answers in this part of the website to help address those questions that you might have. And then all of this work that Frameworks has been doing, if you'd like to go back to the original source material and look at the research that they've done so that you can see sort of what kinds of sample sizes they used and what their actual methodology was, if you need to convince yourself or your colleagues or other stakeholders about the robustness and rigor with which this research was conducted, you can look at all of this. And then finally, I'll say, as I mentioned, this is a collaboration amongst a lot of after-school leaders and stakeholders. And while I don't have the logos here, I think, of every single group that's here, but this represents most of the groups. I think I have 19 out of the 20 groups or so. So as I said, we lead it as a project of the After School Alliance, but we've tried to make it a very, very representative group representing researchers, practitioners, policy folks, professional associations, so that we have a really good handle on sort of the stakes in the field and who's doing what and how we can make sure that folks who have an interest in this issue have a chance to express their opinion and feed into this work. So one last thing I'll point out is you can download individual pieces, as you see here, for the talking points, etc. But there's also a longer 25-page or so document that you can download, which is the full after-school STEM messaging kit that contains all of this material, including the infographic that I showed you at the end. So again, the website is afterschoolstemhub.org. I encourage you to check it out, download whatever you need, and use it at will. And so share with your colleagues, spread the word. And I will say that personally, I've found this work with Frameworks quite transformative. While I have obviously working at the Alliance, I very much believe in systems change and public policy change. I've become even more convinced about the power of language in really helping to make that change come about. And some of the work that Frameworks has done has been truly eye-opening for me, and I very much watch what I say and how I say it, and I think that actually resonates pretty well with the stakeholder community that I speak with. So I hope that you can use it, and in the meantime, as I said, if you have questions, please do put it into the chat box, and we will do our best to answer it, and Jen and I can hang out for a few extra minutes. I realize we're coming up on the 2 o'clock mark, but if you can stay and would like to engage with us, we're happy to stay and answer questions. And if not, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your interest and attention to this topic, and I hope that we can continue to work together on spreading the good word about after-school STEM over the coming months and years. Hi, there's one question about which funders supported this important work. So as I said, for the actual STEM hub work that the Alliance is leading, that was funded by the Noyce Foundation, but the work that Frameworks is doing on a large project called the Core Story of Education is funded by a whole consortium of funders that you can find if you go to the Frameworks website. It's Noyce Foundation came in to fund Frameworks on the informal STEM education piece of it. Are there any other questions?
I'll say, this is Jen, I'll just jump in to say we would love to hear how your framing attempts go. So if you try using any of these frames in your communications, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to see examples of the frames out there in the world being used. So we encourage you to send those to us. If you have them and would like to share, we would love to see them.
Yeah, I'll second that, we're very interested to see sort of how well you're able to use these recommendations and suggestions, and if you're running into any challenges, we want to hear about it, because we think that we've made a set of tools and resources available for you on the website, but we'd love to keep adding to it, but we need to know sort of what would be most useful for the field to be able to do that.
And if you haven't filled out the feedback survey, we'd love for you to do that. Just click on the SurveyMonkey link, and it'll take you to a quick survey that'll give us a chance to get a sense of your response to the webinar so we can have that for future planning.
Yeah, so I will say that there were a couple of questions about funding from Beverly, and as I mentioned, I think Noyce funded the after-school STEM and informal STEM education piece of the Frameworks project on the Core Story of Education, but the whole Core Story of Education itself was funded by a large consortium of funders, and you can find that list if you go to the Frameworks website. And then there was a question about, have we beta tested the frames with any of the partner organizations yet? And yes and no. I mean, as I mentioned when I walked through the website, the Boys and Girls Club are a partner in the STEM Hub work, and so we are getting it out through them, but we don't know exactly how much this has sort of infiltrated their messaging and the kinds of materials that they're producing. But our goal is precisely to do that, is to actually hope that it will be valuable to all the partners in the STEM Hub and beyond to use these messages and the toolkits that we're making available. And we will know in a year or two's time, basically, if how much this has spread through the community as we start to look at materials the field is starting to produce.
I think I see another question here about reframing away from global economy benefits when discussing STEM. We covered that in the first webinar, so I encourage you to listen to that recording. But briefly, I can say that in all of our research, what we found is that making an appeal to global competition, so making sure the U.S. remains at the top of the world or bringing it up to the level of other nations, that sort of thing, actually depresses support for STEM learning and informal STEM learning. What we recommend instead is the future preparation values, so that you make the case for the need for STEM programs and after-school STEM programs in order to make sure that we as a country, our communities are prepared for the future and for the challenges of the future. There's a lot of research, on why an interpretation on our results and why global competition fails, but in brief, it's that what you're really doing is reminding people of their defaults in the swamp, those culture model defaults that they use, reminding them that of their ways of thinking about our place in the world and a kind of fatalistic nostalgia. We used to be good, but we're not anymore, and that sort of fatalism winds up overwhelming people, making them think, what's the point? We're never going to be as good as we once were. So there's a nostalgia that it calls up that's really unproductive because it makes people default to thinking about sort of fatalistic messages that are often swirling around in our public discourse about America's fall from being in top of the world, et cetera, et cetera. And the other problem with that prime is that it encourages people to think about differences among groups. And so if you're asking them to think about the differences between groups, nation to nation, you're also priming them to think about the differences among groups within our country, which brings us back to cultural differences and who has drive and motivation and who doesn't, and all of those really unhelpful default assumptions people make about groups. So you want to avoid that altogether, and future preparation is really the value that will get you where you want to go, more so than global competition.
Any final questions? And we'll end in a couple of minutes here, but if you have a burning question that you'd like to get in there. And Gia, I hope that Jen's answer sort of addressed the question you had about framing global competition versus future preparation.
Yeah, future preparation focuses on our whole community. Global competition focuses on the differences between communities, and that's unproductive, whereas future preparation is really about, this is a positive thing that we all have a stake in. I don't see any more questions out there, so I
think, I was just looking to see if there were any final questions coming in, but I think that we have reached the end of the webinar. Thank you all so much for participating in it and for your interest in this topic. Be sure to check out the website and the resources that are available to you, and don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any questions. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.